His name is known in both Russia and Armenia. Stalin himself respected him, and soldiers called him a fair commander. Ivan Khristoforovich Bagramyan was a man who rose from being a peasant's son to becoming a Marshal of the Soviet Union. He participated in the most important battles of the Great Patriotic War, from the defense of Moscow to Operation Bagration. Who was he really? A strict staff officer or a commander who understood his soldiers? Today we will reveal the story of Marshal Bagramyan, Stalin's Armenian commander. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new documentary research. What do you think? Did Stalin value Bagramyan for his military talent or for his personal honesty and straightforwardness? Write your opinion in the comments. In 1897, in the small Armenian village of Chardakhly in the Yelizavetpol province, a boy was born who was destined to become one of the greatest commanders of the 20th century. Ivan Khristoforovich Bagramyan was born into a simple peasant family, where Armenian traditions were intertwined with the harsh reality of the Russian Empire. The future marshal's father, Khristofor Bagramyan, was a railway employee, a profession that was considered quite prestigious for a member of a national minority at that time. His mother, Marusia, raised her children in the spirit of Armenian traditions, passing on to them a love for their native culture and language. Ancient Armenian songs were sung in the house, and legends were told about the glorious past of a people who had endured many trials. From an early age, little Ivan showed a seriousness and determination unusual for his age. His fellow villagers noticed how the boy could watch adults work for hours, memorizing every detail. He was particularly attracted to the organization of labor, how people coordinate their actions to achieve a common goal. Who could have guessed that these childhood observations would form the basis of his future talent as a military leader? The Bagramyan family lived modestly, but his parents understood the importance of education. In those days, it was a real challenge for an Armenian boy from the provinces to get a good education. National prejudices, limited opportunities, and the need to help the family could have broken a less determined child. Ivan learned to read and write early, not only in Armenian, but also in Russian. His language skills amazed his teachers. The boy easily switched from one language to another, demonstrating an amazing memory and logical thinking. He quickly became one of the best students at the local school, despite having to combine his studies with helping his parents. His maternal grandfather, an old soldier who had fought in the Russo-Turkish wars, had a particular influence on the future commander's character. He told his grandson about military campaigns, about the importance of being brave and honest, and how commanders should take care of their soldiers. These stories touched the boy's soul deeply, laying the foundations for the military thinking that would later impress even Stalin himself. When Ivan turned 14, the family made a fateful decision to send the talented boy to study in the city. This required great financial sacrifice, but his parents believed in their son. They could not have known that they were giving the future Marshal of the Soviet Union a ticket to life, but they intuitively sensed that their child was special. In the city, Ivan enrolled in a technical school for railway transport. The choice of profession was not accidental. At the beginning of the 20th century, railways were the arteries of the empire, and specialists in this field were highly valued. The young Armenian quickly adapted to city life, although he never forgot his roots. It was at the school that Bagramyan's organizational skills became apparent. He naturally became a leader in any group and was able to find common ground with people of different nationalities and views. Teachers noted his ability to see the big picture and analyze complex technical processes. But who could have guessed that these qualities would soon be needed to analyze completely different processes, military operations and political situations? After successfully graduating from school, the young specialist was assigned to work on the railroad. It seemed that his life path was set: a career as an engineer, stability, and the opportunity to help his family. But history had a completely different fate in store for him. The revolutionary events that would soon shake the Russian Empire would radically change not only the life of the country, but also that of the young Armenian engineer. The year 1917 was a turning point not only for the Russian Empire, but also for the young engineer Ivan Bagramyan. The revolutionary events snowballed, and every citizen of the empire had to determine their place in the changes taking place. For representatives of national minorities, this choice was particularly difficult and fateful. Bagramyan was working on the Transcaucasian Railway when news of the February events in Petrograd reached him. The fall of Tsarism was perceived in different ways. Some rejoiced at their liberation from centuries of oppression, while others feared chaos and uncertainty. The young Armenian engineer closely watched the developments, trying to understand where the country was headed. The national question was particularly acute. The Armenian people, who had suffered centuries of oppression in the Ottoman Empire, saw the revolutionary changes as a chance for justice. But which of the opposing forces would truly ensure equality among nations? This question tormented many representatives of national minorities, and the correct answer would determine not only their personal fate, but also the fate of entire peoples. In October 1917, the Bolsheviks seized power in the capital. The news did not reach the South Caucasus immediately, but when it did, it sparked heated debate. Bagramyan carefully studied the programs of various parties, comparing their approaches to the national question. The Bolshevik ideas of equality for all peoples and the creation of a state without national oppression resonated with him. The decision was not an easy one. Joining the Red Army meant breaking with his former life and his established career as an engineer. It was a step into the unknown, full of danger and uncertainty. But Ivan Khristoforovich felt that he could not remain on the sidelines of historical events. Perhaps it was then that he developed a sense of responsibility for the fate of the country, which would later make him one of the best commanders. In 1918, Bagramyan voluntarily joined the Red Army. His technical education and organizational skills were immediately noticed by the command. The young Armenian was sent to junior commander training courses, where he demonstrated outstanding abilities in military affairs. The first months of service became a real school of life. The Red Army was just being formed and lacked experienced commanders, weapons, and food. In these conditions, everyone had to show initiative and take responsibility. Bagramyan quickly established himself as a reliable and intelligent commander, capable of solving the most complex tasks. His abilities were particularly evident in the organization of rear services. His engineering education helped him understand logistics, plan supplies, and establish communication between units. Commanders noted his ability to see the whole picture of an operation, anticipate possible problems, and prepare solutions in advance. Nationality was not an obstacle to a career in the early revolutionary years. On the contrary, the Bolsheviks demonstrated internationalism by promoting representatives of different nations to command positions. But would the young Armenian commander be able to maintain this trust in more difficult times, when the national question would once again become a sensitive issue? During this period, Bagramyan became acquainted with the basics of Marxist-Leninist theory, studied the works of the classics, and participated in political discussions. Communist ideas about a just society and the equality of all workers regardless of nationality deeply touched his soul. He sincerely believed in the possibility of building a new world. His first combat operations showed that the engineer was turning out to be a good military leader. Bagramyan remained calm in critical situations, was able to quickly assess the situation and make the right decisions. His subordinates noted that the commander always cared about his people and never sent soldiers into futile attacks. By the end of 1918, the young commander already had a reputation as a competent and promising officer. But even more serious trials awaited him ahead. The Civil War was just beginning, and every participant in this tragedy would have to go through the crucible of the most brutal battles. Would yesterday's engineer be able to withstand this test and prove his talent as a commander? The Civil War became a real baptism of fire for even Bagramyan. In 1919, the conflict in the Caucasus became particularly fierce. Class contradictions intertwined with national problems, creating an explosive mixture that threatened to tear the region apart. The young commander was assigned to the 11th Red Army, which was operating in the North Caucasus against General Denikin's troops. It was a serious test to confront experienced White Army officers, many of whom had fought in World War I and had a wealth of combat experience. Could a former engineer, who had become a commander only a year ago, stand up to such opponents? The first battles showed that theoretical knowledge was radically different from the reality of war. Bagramyan was confronted with the chaos of battle, where the situation can change in a matter of minutes, and the lives of hundreds of people depend on the correctness of a single decision. But it was in these critical situations that his main qualities came to the fore. His ability to keep his cool and see the big picture of the battle. The battle near the village of Proletarskaya in early 1920 was particularly memorable. White Guard units suddenly attacked the Red Army positions, threatening to encircle an entire regiment. The situation seemed hopeless. The enemy had superior forces. There was a shortage of ammunition, and the troops were demoralized. Many commanders in such a situation would have given the order to retreat. Bagramyan made an unexpected decision. Instead of retreating, he organized a counterattack with reserve forces, simultaneously ordering sappers to blow up a railway bridge behind enemy lines. This maneuver not only stopped the White Army's advance, but also forced them to retreat hastily, fearing they would be cut off from their main forces. Where did this young commander get such an understanding of tactics, such an ability to think outside the box? The success at Proletarskaya brought Bagramyan recognition from his superiors. He was appointed Chief of Staff of the brigade, a position that required not only courage, but also organizational skills, the ability to plan operations and coordinate the actions of units. The former engineer coped brilliantly with his new responsibilities. During this period, his human qualities were particularly evident. Soldiers noted that their commander never forgot the needs of his subordinates, always finding time to listen to everyone and help them solve their personal problems. In the conditions of the Civil War, when brothers fought against brothers, such an attitude was especially valuable. No one cared about Bagramyan's nationality and combat conditions. At the front, completely different qualities were valued: professionalism, bravery, and concern for people. The Armenian commander was respected among subordinates of various nationalities. Russian soldiers, Ukrainian Cossacks, Georgian volunteers all saw him as a fair and competent commander. In the summer of 1920, Denikin's troops launched their last major offensive in the Caucasus. Bagramyan participated in organizing the defense of Rostov-on-Don. where his strategic abilities were particularly evident. He proposed an unconventional defense plan based on active operations behind enemy lines and the coordinated use of all branches of the military. But the most serious test was not military action, but the moral choices that had to be made every day. The Civil War knew no mercy. Executions of prisoners, terror against the civilian population, cruelty towards the families of opponents. Bagramyan managed to retain his humanity even in these inhuman conditions, which set him apart from many of his contemporaries. By the end of the Civil War, the young Armenian commander had a reputation as one of the best staff officers in the Red Army. His analytical skills, ability to plan operations, and organize cooperation between units were noted by everyone who worked with him. Who could have imagined that these qualities would be useful to him in the future for planning operations on a completely different scale? Operations that would determine the outcome of the most terrible war in human history. The end of the Civil War opened a new chapter in the life of Ivan Khristoforovich Bagramyan. Soviet power had been established, but the young country faced the enormous tasks of reconstruction and modernization. The Red Army also needed radical reforms, from the partisan formations of the Civil War to a regular modern army. In 1921, Bagramyan was sent to study at the Frunze Military Academy. This was a recognition of his abilities and an investment in the future of the Red Army. For an Armenian officer who began his career as a railway engineer, admission to the country's main military academy was a real triumph. His academic years became a time of intensive study of military art. Bagramyan immersed himself in the history of great battles, studied tactics and strategy, and mastered the theory of deep operations developed by Soviet military theorists. His analytical mind, honed by his engineering education, easily grasped the complex concepts of military science. He was particularly interested in the organization of cooperation between different branches of the armed forces. In modern warfare, victory is achieved not by the bravery of individual heroes, but by the coordinated actions of infantry, artillery, aviation, and tanks. Who could have imagined that this theoretical knowledge would soon be needed to organize operations on a scale that would exceed the wildest expectations of academic teachers? The Academy's cadets represented the cream of the Red Army. They were people who had gone through the crucible of the Civil War and demonstrated outstanding abilities. Among them were future marshals and generals, commanders who would lead armies in the most terrible war of the 20th century. Bagramyan quickly won the respect of his comrades thanks to his erudition and modesty. The Academy's national composition was international. Russians and Ukrainians, Belarusians and Georgians, Armenians and Azerbaijanis studied here. The Soviet government consistently pursued a policy of promoting national personnel, which gave representatives of all peoples of the USSR equal opportunities to serve their homeland. But would this internationalism survive in more difficult times? After successfully graduating from the Academy in 1924, Bagramyan was appointed to the Belarusian military district as Chief of Staff of a regiment. It was a responsible position that required deep knowledge and organizational skills. The young Armenian officer coped brilliantly with his new duties. The 1920s were a time of modernization for the Red Army. New weapons appeared, tactics changed, and the organizational structure was improved. Bagramyan actively participated in all these processes, offering rationalization ideas based on his engineering background and combat experience in the Civil War. His work on improving staff service was particularly fruitful. Bagramyan developed several methods for planning operations, which were subsequently adopted for use in other parts of the district. His ability to systematize information and see logical connections between various factors was highly valued by the command. In 1928, he was sent to study at the General Staff Academy, the country's highest military educational institution. Admission there meant joining the elite of the Red Army, the circle of people entrusted with planning the defense of the state. For an Armenian officer, this was another step toward the top of the military hierarchy. His years of study at the General Staff Academy were a time of deep study of strategy. Bagramyan studied the experience of World War I, analyzed the reasons for victories and defeats, and reflected on the future of military art. His thesis was devoted to the problems of troop management in large-scale operations, a topic that would soon become vitally important to him. But could he have imagined then that the theoretical knowledge he had acquired in peacetime would have to be applied in the most brutal of wars, when the success of an operation and the fate of the entire country would depend on the correctness of every decision? The 1930s brought tragic changes to the life of the Soviet Union and its armed forces. A period that was supposed to be a time of flourishing military art and strengthening defense capabilities turned into an era of mass repression, which did not spare the Red Army. For Ivan Khristoforovich Bagramyan, these years became a severe test of his loyalty to his ideals and personal fortitude. The year 1937 went down in history as the year of the Great Terror. Repression fell upon the Red Army's command staff with unprecedented force. Marshals Tukhachevsky, Yakir, and Uborovich, along with thousands of generals and officers, were arrested and shot. An atmosphere of suspicion and fear permeated all levels of the military hierarchy. How did an Armenian officer manage to avoid the fate of many of his colleagues during those terrible years? This question remained a mystery to researchers for a long time. Bagramyan's nationality could have been both a protection and an additional reason for suspicion. In a situation where any connection with foreigners was interpreted as espionage, Armenian roots could be interpreted as a potential connection with the Dashnaks or other hostile elements. Bagramyan's reputation as an impeccable officer and a devoted communist saved him. Over the years of service, he had proven himself to be a person who never participated in political intrigues and focused exclusively on his professional duties. His colleagues and subordinates noted his honesty, integrity, and lack of careerist ambitions. Another important factor was that Bagramyan was never close to the repressed military leaders. He was not part of the military opposition and did not participate in discussions about military doctrine, which were later classified as sabotage. His interests were limited to narrow professional issues of staff work. Nevertheless, the atmosphere of those years could not fail to affect him. Seeing his comrades from the academy and the commanders with whom he had served being arrested, Bagramyan understood the fragility of his position. What thoughts crossed his mind during those sleepless nights when every knock on the door could mean arrest? In 1938, Bagramyan was appointed head of the operations department of the Kiev military district headquarters. It was a promotion, but in the context of mass repression, any new appointment was viewed with ambivalence. Had he been appointed to replace his arrested predecessor? Did this mean that the leadership suspected him of something? Working at the district headquarters required maximum concentration. It was necessary to rebuild the troop command system that had been destroyed by repression, prepare defense plans, and train new commanders who had replaced those who had been repressed. Bagramyan immersed himself in his work, trying not to think about the political situation. The situation with personnel was particularly difficult. Mass arrests had created huge gaps in the command structure. People without sufficient experience had to be appointed to key positions. Bagramyan took an active part in training new personnel, sharing his knowledge and experience with young officers. Did he realize then that these young commanders would soon be baptized by fire in the most terrible war, and that the fate of the country would depend on their level of training? The events on Lake Khasan and the Khalkhin-Gol River showed that the threat of war was becoming increasingly real, and that the army had to be prepared for serious trials. During these difficult years, Bagramyan's human qualities were particularly evident. He never participated in the persecution of enemies of the people, never wrote denunciations, and never tried to advance his career at the expense of repressed colleagues. Such a position required considerable courage and integrity. By the end of the 1930s, it had become clear that the repressions had seriously weakened the combat capability of the Red Army. The Soviet-Finnish War revealed deep problems in the management of troops, the training of commanders, and the organization of supplies. But who could have imagined that these mistakes would have to be corrected in the midst of the most brutal war against the strongest military machine of the time? June 22, 1941, became a dark day in the history of the Soviet Union. At 4 in the morning, without a declaration of war, German troops invaded the western borders of the country. For Colonel Ivan Khristoforovich Bagramyan, who held the position of Chief of the Operations Department of the Kiev Military District Headquarters, this day marked the beginning of the most difficult trials of his life. The first reports of the invasion reached the district headquarters at around 4:30 a.m. The officer on duty woke Bagramyan with a phone call. "Comrade Colonel, the Germans are bombing our airfields." These words came as a bolt from the blue. Despite numerous intelligence reports about Germany's preparations for war, the reality of the invasion took many by surprise. How did an Armenian officer find himself at the center of events that determined the fate not only of the USSR, but of the entire world? His presence at the headquarters of one of the key military districts was not a coincidence, but the result of many years of painstaking service and recognition of his professional qualities. The Kiev military district found itself in the direction of the main strike of Army Group South. The enemy had overwhelming superiority in forces and resources, especially in aviation and tanks. German troops, who had experience of war in Europe, faced Red Army units, many of whose commanders had no experience of leading large formations in real combat conditions. From the very first hours of the war, Bagramyan found himself at the center of critical decision-making. As head of the operations department, he was responsible for planning the actions of the district's troops, organizing cooperation between units, and maintaining communication with Moscow. In a rapidly changing situation, these tasks became extremely difficult. The situation with aviation was particularly difficult. On the very first day of the war, the German Air Force launched devastating strikes on Soviet airfields. Hundreds of aircraft were destroyed on the ground before they could take off. This created a critical situation. Ground forces were left without air cover, and the enemy gained complete air superiority. What feelings did a professional soldier experience when he saw all his pre-war defense plans collapse? Years of preparation, carefully developed mobilization and deployment plans, all of this proved useless in the face of the reality of the Blitzkrieg. The commander of the district, Colonel General Kirponos, was an experienced military leader, but the scale of the disaster exceeded all expectations. An atmosphere of tension and confusion reigned at the district headquarters. Communication with the units was disrupted. The reports coming in were contradictory. and it was extremely difficult to get a clear picture of what was happening. It was in these conditions that Bagramyan's best qualities came to the fore. His analytical mind, his ability to remain calm in critical situations, and his ability to see the big picture of the fighting became invaluable in the chaos of the first days of the war. He worked almost without sleep, coordinating the actions of the headquarters and maintaining contact with the general staff in Moscow. The tragedy unfolded with terrifying speed. German tank wedges broke through the depths of the defenses, surrounding entire armies. Attempts at an organized retreat were often thwarted by communication breakdowns and confusion in command. Thousands of Soviet soldiers and officers were captured or killed in unequal battles. But even then, in the first tragic days of the war, the foundations were being laid for the resistance that would lead the Red Army to Berlin 4 years later. Bagramyan saw not only defeats and failures, but also examples of heroism, fortitude, and a willingness to fight to the last bullet. He was particularly struck by the behavior of ordinary soldiers. Many of them were participating in combat for the first time and had no combat experience, but they showed remarkable fortitude. They held their ground when it seemed pointless, continuing to fight even when they understood the hopelessness of the situation. This spirit, this willingness to sacrifice themselves, became the foundation on which victory was later built. By the end of June, it was clear that the pre-war defense plans had failed. It was necessary to urgently develop a new strategy and find ways to stop the enemy's advance. For Bagramyan, this meant not only professional challenges, but also personal responsibility for the fate of the country. In the fall of 1941, fate brought Ivan Khristoforovich Bagramyan to the very heart of the greatest battle of the early period of the war, the Battle of Moscow. After the tragic events in Ukraine, where hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers died as a result of the Kiev encirclement, he was transferred to the General Staff and then appointed head of the Operations Department of the Western Front headquarters. By October 1941, the situation near Moscow was critical. During Operation Typhoon, German troops broke through the Soviet defenses and rapidly advanced toward the capital. Vyazma and Bryansk fell, and hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers were surrounded. Panic gripped not only the military command, but also the civilian population. What did the Armenian officer, who had come to defend the Russian capital in its most tragic hour, feel? For Bagramyan, this was not just an order to transfer to a new position, but a personal challenge, a test of his loyalty to the oath he had once taken. Moscow was not only the capital of the USSR, but also a symbol of a multinational country where every people had the right to equality and justice. General Zhukov was appointed commander of the Western Front, a tough, demanding man with an iron will and strategic thinking. It was under his leadership that Bagramyan was to participate in planning operations that would determine the fate not only of Moscow, but of the entire war. Working at the front headquarters during those critical days required superhuman effort. The situation was changing by the hour, with German tank wedges breaking through closer and closer to the capital. It was necessary to simultaneously organize defenses on existing lines, plan counterattacks, and coordinate the transfer of reserves from across the country. Bagramyan proved himself to be an indispensable staff officer. His ability to quickly analyze vast amounts of information, see the big picture of operations, and propose unconventional solutions was highly valued by the front command. But his main quality was his ability to remain optimistic even in the most hopeless situations. The days in mid-October were particularly memorable. when German troops broke through to Mojaisk and posed an immediate threat to Moscow. The question of evacuating the capital was discussed in government circles, and many foreign diplomats had already left the city. During those days, every decision made by the front headquarters was of strategic importance. Bagramyan participated in the development of a plan to defend the capital, which provided for the creation of several defensive lines, the organization of street fighting, and preparation for a prolonged siege. His engineering knowledge proved invaluable in planning defensive structures, organizing barricades, and preparing facilities for destruction. What thoughts crossed his mind as he pored over maps of the Moscow region, marking enemy positions closer and closer to the Kremlin walls? These were not just lines on a map. Behind each of them stood the fates of thousands of people and the future of the country for which he had been fighting for a quarter of a century. The turning point came in November. Despite the severe frosts, German troops made a final attempt to storm Moscow. They approached the city to a distance of 30 kilometers, and in some areas the spires of the Kremlin towers were visible. It seemed that the capital would fall at any moment. But it was during these critical days that the full power of the Soviet defense system, created under the leadership of officers such as Bagramyan, was revealed. The enemy encountered stubborn resistance, suffered huge losses, but was unable to break through the last lines of defense. The steadfastness of Moscow's defenders was the first serious defeat for the hitherto invincible German army. The preparation of the counteroffensive near Moscow became a moment of glory for the staff officers of the Western Front. It was necessary to concentrate the strike groups in the strictest secrecy, organize cooperation between the fronts, and ensure the surprise of the first strike. Bagramyan took an active part in this work. Who could have imagined that a young Armenian engineer who joined the Red Army in the revolutionary year of 1918 would become one of the architects of the first major victory over fascism? The Battle of Moscow was not only a military triumph, but also a moral turning point in the entire war. It showed that the invincible German army could be defeated. In the spring of 1942, Khristoforovich Bagramyan's career took a qualitative leap forward. After his successful participation in the Battle of Moscow, he was appointed Deputy Commander of the Western Front for Logistics and then Commander of the 16th Army. For an officer who had spent the entire war in headquarters, the transition to direct command of a large unit was a serious challenge. Why was Bagramyan, who had never commanded an army before, entrusted with the leadership of a 100,000-strong military unit? The answer lies in the special trust he had earned from the High Command thanks to his professionalism, dedication, and ability to find a way out of the most difficult situations. At the time of Bagramyan's appointment as commander, the 16th Army was part of the Western Front and was engaged in fighting in the Rzhev direction. This was one of the bloodiest sections of the Soviet-German front, where the fighting had been going on with varying success for several months. The Germans had created a powerful defensive system here, which the Soviet troops tried to break through at the cost of enormous sacrifices. The first days of commanding the army became a real school of military art for Bagramyan. It is one thing to plan operations at the front headquarters, but quite another to be personally responsible for the lives of tens of thousands of subordinates. Every decision made by the army commander had direct and immediate consequences for the people on the front lines. The situation with casualties was particularly difficult. The Rzhev meat grinder was devouring divisions one after another. Reinforcements were melting away before our eyes, and experienced commanders were becoming fewer and fewer. In such conditions, the main task was not only to carry out combat orders, but also to preserve people and use resources wisely. How did the Armenian general manage to gain authority among subordinates of various nationalities? The secret lay in his sincere attitude towards people. Bagramyan never demanded from his subordinates what he could not do himself. He regularly visited the front lines, personally communicated with regimental and divisional commanders, and delved into their problems. Soldiers and officers quickly appreciated their new commander. They saw that the general did not sit deep in the rear, but shared all the hardships of war with them. His orders were always reasonable, took into account the real situation, and did not demand the impossible. In a short time, Bagramyan became not just a boss to the army, but a true leader. The first serious test was the Rzhev-Sikevka offensive in the summer of 1942. The 16th Army was supposed to break through the German defenses and advance towards Sikevka. The operation required careful preparation, coordination with neighboring units, and the competent use of artillery and aviation. Bagramyan approached the planning of the operation with all the thoroughness of an experienced staff officer. He personally studied the terrain, conducted reconnaissance, and assessed the enemy's capabilities. Particular attention was paid to organizing cooperation between different branches of the military: infantry, tanks, artillery, and sappers. But the reality of combat proved once again to be more complicated than any calculations. The German defense was so powerful that even carefully prepared attacks yielded only limited results. The enemy used all the advantages of defense, skillfully maneuvered its reserves, and launched counterattacks against the advancing Soviet units. Nevertheless, the 16th Army under the command of Bagramyan accomplished its objectives. His troops broke through the first line of German defenses, occupied several settlements, and pinned down significant enemy forces. Although the operation did not achieve its strategic objectives, it demonstrated the growing skill of the Soviet troops and their commanders. It was especially important that the army under Bagramyan's command suffered relatively few losses. This was achieved through careful preparation of each attack, competent use of artillery, and refusal to launch frontal assaults on fortified positions. The conservation of human resources became an increasingly important factor as the war dragged on. By the end of 1942, General Bagramyan had established himself as one of the best army commanders in the Red Army. His name became known in the general staff, and his fellow generals spoke of him with respect. But even more serious trials awaited him, which would finally confirm his reputation as an outstanding commander. The summer of 1943 was a turning point, not only in the Great Patriotic War, but also in the military career of Ivan Khristoforovich Bagramyan. On the eve of the grand battle near Kursk, he received a new appointment as commander of the 11th Guards Army. This was recognition of his previous achievements and a sign of trust that was not given to every military commander. After all, it was in the summer of 1943 that it was decided whether the Soviet troops would finally be able to move from defense to strategic offensive. The Battle of Kursk became the largest tank operation in human history. The German command saw it as a chance to turn the tide of war in their favor by destroying Soviet forces in the front line and regaining the strategic initiative. For the Red Army, it was a matter of survival. The enemy concentrated its best tank units, including elite SS divisions, in the Kursk direction. The armies led by commanders such as Bagramyan were to oppose them. Would the Armenian commander be able to withstand this test, which would be an exam for the entire Red Army? The 11th Guards Army held positions on the central sector of the Kursk Bulge. Preparations for the defense were carried out with unprecedented thoroughness. On the initiative of the Front Command, deeply echeloned defensive lines were created. Several strips of trenches, anti-tank ditches, minefields, and artillery positions. Bagramyan's technical expertise and engineering background played a decisive role here. He demanded that his subordinates strictly adhere to all standards, carefully checked the condition of the fortifications, and personally visited sections of the Euro front. Particular attention was paid to anti-tank defense. German generals hoped to break through the front with powerful tank wedge attacks. Bagramyan understood that they could only be stopped by a comprehensive effort. Skillful placement of artillery, massive use of anti-tank weapons, and coordination with infantry and aviation. With his direct participation, a fire system was created that would later become one of the factors in thwarting German plans. In July 1943, the German offensive began. The first days of the battle proved to be incredibly difficult. Tank divisions broke through to the positions of Soviet troops, and artillery and airstrikes rained down one after another. The troops of the 11th Guards Army met the enemy with concentrated fire. But how long could they withstand the onslaught of almost the entire elite of the Wehrmacht? The fighting was desperate. German troops threw their newest tanks into battle. Tigers, Panthers, and Ferdinand self-propelled guns. It proved incredibly difficult to counter this technology. But it was here that Bagramyan's skill as a commander came to the fore. He did not allow his troops to panic, skillfully maneuvered his reserves, and deployed them only at critical points. Thanks to this, the defense held. The climax was the oral stage of the battle. The Supreme Command headquarters decided to launch a counter-offensive. Bagration's 11th Guards Army was assigned the most important role, to break through the German defenses in the Oral direction, and thus make a decisive contribution to the disruption of Operation Citadel. The offensive required the highest level of coordination between artillery, tanks, and infantry. Bagramyan once again demonstrated his outstanding strategic planning abilities. His troops skillfully used the initiative, bypassing the most fortified areas of the enemy and striking at their weak points. Why was the Armenian commander's talent as a general particularly evident during those days? Perhaps it was because he saw war not only as a sequence of operational orders, but also as a drama of people who went to their deaths for the sake of victory. Bagramyan possessed a rare quality. He did not disregard human lives for the sake of beautiful diagrams on a map. His decisions were dictated not only by the logic of military science, but also by his inner sense of human duty. The Oral Offensive became one of the greatest triumphs of the Red Army. Bagramyan's troops made an invaluable contribution to the liberation of Oral and the breakthrough of the German line of defense. It was after these events that he finally established himself as a commander of strategic stature. His name became one of the symbols of the growing power of the Red Army. The Battle of Kursk ended in a crushing defeat for the German troops. For the USSR, it was the first major strategic victory, after which the initiative finally passed to the Red Army. This meant that Bagramyan's star had finally risen. His path to the highest echelons of the military hierarchy was predetermined. But new operations, new battles, and new trials lay ahead. The autumn of 1943 marked a new stage in the career of Ivan Khristoforovich Bagramyan. After the victory at the Kursk Bulge, the Soviet command moved on to large-scale offensive operations in Ukraine. For the first time in a long time, the Red Army had the opportunity to build on its success, moving from local victories to the strategic liberation of entire regions. One of the key figures in this offensive period was the Armenian commander Bagramyan. who was entrusted with the command of the First Baltic Front and then the front that participated in the liberation of Ukraine. Kiev and left bank Ukraine were of great importance, not only militarily, but also politically. The most important transport arteries passed through here. Fertile lands provided the enemy with food, and cities provided industrial products. For Nazi Germany, holding Ukraine meant preserving strategic resources. For the USSR, the liberation of these lands was not only a matter of military necessity, but also a symbol of the return to life of an entire people who had survived the horrors of occupation. Would the Red Army be able to liberate such an important region? And what contribution would the Armenian general make to this? Bagramyan understood the importance of the task at hand. The Germans had turned Ukraine into a veritable fortress. The enemy fortified positions along the Dnieper, created powerful defensive lines, and saturated the territory with artillery and armored vehicles. The Kiev defense lines were of particular importance, as German troops planned to hold back the Soviet offensive for as long as possible. For Bagramyan, an organizer and tactician, such an obstacle was a challenge in which he could demonstrate all his abilities. The operation to liberate Kiev began in November 1943. The offensive was conducted under difficult conditions, a cold autumn, crossing the Dnieper, and constant enemy counterattacks. Bagration took part in coordinating the actions of the fronts, which required the utmost effort. Soviet troops were forced to literally carry weapons and equipment on their hands and build pontoon bridges under constant fire. Could success be expected in such circumstances? However, it was precisely competent organization that played a decisive role. Thanks to careful preparation, a surprise attack was launched from the left bank of the Dnieper, which allowed Soviet troops to break through German defenses and enter Kiev. The liberation of the Ukrainian capital was one of the most significant victories of the second half of 1943. Bagramyan made a significant contribution to this success as the organizer of cooperation between the fronts and a proponent of careful planning. But the fighting for Ukraine did not end there. The German command made desperate attempts to regain lost positions. South of Kiev, in the Zhytomyr area, fierce battles broke out. The Germans launched counterattacks with tank divisions, hoping to surround and destroy Red Army units. Here, Bagramyan's abilities came to the fore again. He skillfully used reserves, managed to build defenses and hold key positions, preventing the enemy from achieving its goals. Each liberated city in Ukraine became a symbol of hope for the people. Soviet soldiers entering the liberated settlements saw the eyes of residents who had survived 2 years of occupation. Burned villages, destroyed factories, concentration camps. All this served as a reminder of what the struggle was for. Bagramyan, traveling to the front lines, witnessed these scenes of human tragedy himself. Wasn't this what strengthened his resolve to continue the offensive despite any difficulties? In the winter of 1944, the offensive continued. The Red Army liberated the Zhytomyr, Vinnytsia, and Rivne regions. Bagramyan's troops participated in the coordination of huge front operations, where clear interaction between the armies was crucial. Here, the Armenian general's talent as a staff officer was fully revealed. His ability to make plans, take into account all the details of supply, and apply his experience of deep operations helped the offensive to develop in a more organized and effective manner than in the early years of the war. One of the most memorable moments was the liberation of right bank Ukraine. Soviet troops crushed the enemy, recapturing city after city, and Bagramyan contributed to each of these successes. His decisions and ability to work with the commanders of neighboring armies made it possible to avoid setbacks, coordinate strikes, and reinforce weak points in a timely manner. The liberation of Ukraine in 1943 to 1944 was a crucial stage in the war. It was not just a matter of regaining territory, it was a severe test of the Red Army's maturity. Along with thousands of commanders, generals, and marshals, the Armenian commander Bagramyan passed this test with flying colors. His name was increasingly mentioned among those who were strongly associated with the victorious offensive. But new challenges awaited him ahead. Now he had to fight for the liberation of Belarus and the Baltic states. The summer of 1944 was the time when the Red Army dealt one of the most devastating blows to German troops in the entire history of World War II. The Belarusian operation, codenamed Bagration, became a triumph of Soviet military art and, at the same time, the pinnacle of Ivan Khristoforovich Bagramyan's military career. It was in this operation, as commander of the First Baltic Front, that he played a decisive role, demonstrating his mastery of strategic planning and impeccable coordination of armies numbering in the thousands. By the summer of 1944, the Red Army had a significant advantage in terms of forces and resources. The victories at Moscow, Stalingrad, and Kursk laid the foundation for a decisive offensive. Now was the moment to finally turn the tide of the war and drive the enemy from Soviet soil. Belarus, occupied since 1941, became the arena for the future battle. Here, the Wehrmacht had created a powerful defense system, at the center of which was Army Group Center. The German command considered these positions impregnable. But was this defense really so strong in the face of dozens of Red Army divisions? The First Baltic Front, led by Bagramyan, was to strike in the northern sectors of the operation. Its task was to pin down enemy forces, break through German lines in the direction of Vitebsk, and ensure the encirclement of a significant Wehrmacht group. Preparations were carried out with unprecedented thoroughness. Bagramyan demanded complete secrecy. Troops were moved under cover of night. Artillery positions were carefully camouflaged, and false targets were used to mislead the enemy. On the eve of the operation, a meeting was held at the Supreme Command headquarters, where Stalin personally reviewed the plans of the front commanders. Bagramyan reported on the actions of his front, calmly and confidently. His ability to analyze the situation and clearly formulate tasks impressed even the most demanding leaders. Wasn't this moment the final proof that the Armenian general was among the elite of Soviet commanders? On June 22, 1944, exactly 3 years after the start of the war, an artillery volley rang out. The offensive began. Hundreds of guns and Katyushas rained down on German positions. Under cover of this barrage of fire, the Red Army's infantry and tanks went on the offensive. The troops of the First Baltic Front, commanded by Bagramyan, acted in an organized and rapid manner, breaking through the enemy's deep defenses. The Vitebsk cauldron was of particular importance. German units in this area were surrounded and destroyed. Bagramyan personally coordinated the actions of the armies, ensuring complete coordination of the strikes. His orders were precise, and decisions were made lightning fast. As a result, the front's troops defeated several German divisions and captured thousands of soldiers and officers. How was such success achieved when, just 3 years earlier, the Red Army had been retreating to Moscow? The answer was that the army had changed, learned, and grown stronger. And along with it, its commanders had also grown. The front advanced rapidly. By the beginning of July, Soviet troops had liberated Minsk. Army Group Center effectively ceased to exist as a combat-ready formation. Bagramyan commanded not just an offensive, but a whole symphony of military art, in which each army and each corps performed its assigned role. His ability to coordinate the actions of huge masses of troops was the key to a brilliant victory. The Belarusian Operation Bagration went down in history as one of the largest and most successful military campaigns of the 20th century. In a matter of weeks, the Red Army advanced hundreds of kilometers, liberated Belarus, and turned the entire strategic situation on the Eastern Front. Bagration's name is forever inscribed in the annals of this victory. His tactical insights, iron will, and ability to maintain contact with his soldiers made him one of the symbols of the Soviet Union's offensive art. But there was still one more important task ahead: the Baltic states, where German troops were preparing to hold out until the end. Would the Armenian general be able to cope with this challenge? The autumn of 1944 was a time of new trials for the First Baltic Front, under the command of Ivan Khristoforovich Bagramyan. After its grand victory in Belarus, the Red Army continued its advance westward. Now the Armenian general was faced with the task of liberating the Baltic states, where German troops were preparing to put up fierce resistance. Holding on to these territories was of particular importance to Hitler. The Baltic ports provided access to the Baltic Sea, and the loss of this region would deprive Germany of important communications. The Baltic states were saturated with German troops and fortifications. Fierce battles unfolded here, which went down in history as the Baltic Operation. The Red Army fronts had to drive the enemy out of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, while coordinating their actions across a vast territory. Would the Armenian commander be able to conduct the operation as brilliantly as he had in Belarus? The First Baltic Front was tasked with encircling the German group, cutting off its retreat routes, and preventing it from retreating to East Prussia. In the difficult conditions of marshy terrain and with limited communications, this task required a special skill of coordination. Bagramyan acted with his usual thoroughness. His staff developed detailed plans for the transfer of troops and carefully organized supplies and cooperation between the armies. The liberation of Vilnius and Kaunas played a special role. These cities became important strongholds for Soviet troops. Fierce battles took place here. Every house was turned into a fortress. However, despite the resistance of the German garrisons, Bagramyan's troops were able to liberate the cities. His decisions were characterized by firmness. He demanded rapid offensives to prevent the enemy from regrouping. Was it not this persistence that ultimately allowed all lines of defense to be broken through? In the summer and fall of 1944, the troops of the First Baltic Front liberated Lithuania and part of Latvia, reaching the Baltic Sea. The Germans were threatened with the encirclement of the Courland Group, which would later find itself trapped in a pocket until the end of the war. Bagramyan was one of the commanders who organized the strategic encirclement of the enemy, effectively burying Germany's hopes of holding on to the Baltic states. A special moment was Bagramyan's interaction with the local population. The liberated inhabitants of the Baltic cities greeted the Soviet army with mixed feelings. Some were sincerely happy about their liberation from the Nazi regime, while others were wary due to complex national and political reasons. Bagramyan, as a member of a national minority himself, understood the specifics of these sentiments. He demanded that his subordinates show respect for the civilian population and maintain strict discipline and order. This helped to reduce tensions and strengthen trust in the Red Army. The Baltic operation ended with considerable success. German troops were pushed back to a limited bridgehead in Courland. where they no longer posed a serious threat. The Soviet army finally secured control of the Baltic Sea, and Bagramyan's name was cemented among those military leaders who led offensives not only with numbers, but also with intelligence, achieving success where the enemy desperately clung to every town and village. However, the war did not end there. The final campaigns awaited ahead: East Prussia, Königsberg, and the long-awaited finale in Berlin. What role would the Armenian Marshal play in these last chapters of the war? One of the most interesting and at the same time little-studied aspects of Ivan Khristoforovich Bagramyan's biography was his relationship with Stalin. The leader was known for his restraint, suspicion, and extremely harsh approach to personnel issues. Not every military leader could earn Stalin's trust, especially if they were representatives of national minorities. But Bagramyan became one of the few whom Stalin valued and trusted with fateful operations. The secret of this trust lay in several circumstances. First, Bagramyan always distinguished himself with his sober and honest approach to assessing the situation. He did not try to pass off his wishes as reality, did not embellish his reports, and never promised anything that was impossible to fulfill. To Stalin, who was accustomed to constantly fighting against false reports and lies, such qualities seemed rare. Was this the source of Stalin's special respect for the Armenian general? Secondly, Bagramyan was alien to any intrigue. In the conditions of the high command, this quality was particularly valuable. Many generals and marshals were forced to maneuver between the demands of the front and the expectations of the leader, sometimes sacrificing the truth for the sake of maintaining favor. Bagramyan never made such compromises. His reports were clear, respectful, but always honest. One important example of the relationship between the two men was the discussion of the plan for the Belarusian Operation Bagration. According to the recollections of contemporaries, Stalin listened attentively to Bagramyan's reports and asked him many clarifying questions. But, unlike other commanders, the Armenian general did not lose his composure, answering clearly and reasonably, confidently defending his point of view. The leader appreciated this thoroughness and calm dignity. Another important point deserves special attention. At a time when some Armenian national leaders abroad were negotiating with Western countries, Stalin could have viewed the Armenian commanders as potential objects of suspicion. But Bagramyan's behavior never gave cause for doubt. His loyalty to the Soviet Union and the cause of his army was demonstrated not in words, but in deeds on the battlefield. In his memoirs, Bagramyan notes that he attended receptions in the Kremlin on more than one occasion, and did not feel any prejudice on Stalin's part. On the contrary, he was treated with respect. It is particularly noteworthy that in the midst of war, when every mistake could cost a career and a life, the Armenian general not only did not suffer, but was promoted to front commander. Can there be any more eloquent testimony to the leader's trust? It should also be emphasized that Stalin's trust was based on real results. All operations conducted under Bagramyan's leadership were well thought out and highly effective. The leader saw that this man not only knew how to plan, but also brought real victories to the country. After the war, Bagramyan continued to be among those commanders whose opinions were respected at the highest level. Even when his other colleagues were criticized or suspected, his name was associated with stability and ironclad professional integrity. Was this not Bagramyan's true feat? To retain Stalin's trust while remaining an honest and principled officer? After the war, Ivan Khristoforovich Bagramyan did not fade into obscurity like many frontline commanders. On the contrary, his knowledge and experience were in high demand in the post-war restructuring of the country and the armed forces. A new period of his service began, no less responsible and significant than the war years. In the post-war period, he took up the post of commander of the Baltic military district. This region was of particular strategic importance. Pockets of resistance remained here. Nationalist underground groups were active, and the border with Europe required increased attention. Bagramyan skillfully combined firmness with attention to detail. He restored infrastructure, organized combat training for troops, and ensured discipline and a high level of combat readiness. This was followed by a new appointment as commander of the Carpathian military district. This was also a region with a difficult situation. The western regions of Ukraine were engulfed in underground activity, and remnants of armed groups were still active. Here, once again, the qualities of an organizer and experienced military administrator were needed. Bagramyan strove to ensure that regular troops were well trained and at the same time participated in the restoration of the region. Bagratian's work at the General Staff Academy, where he became chief, deserves special attention. His rich practical experience was combined with a deep knowledge of military theory. Under his leadership, a new generation of Soviet commanders was trained to serve in the conditions of the beginning Cold War. He gave lectures, conducted seminars, and shared his personal experience in strategic planning. Did the students themselves realize that they were learning from a man who had made decisions at the level of frontline operations during World War II? Bagramyan paid special attention to a systematic approach to military science. He insisted that future generals be able to think strategically, seeing not only the battlefield, but also the political context of operations. His methodology included analyzing past mistakes and studying the operational art of other countries, including Germany. During this period, the Armenian Marshal also proved himself as an author. He began writing memoirs and articles on military history and analyzing the course of key operations. His memoirs are valuable in that they bear the mark of objectivity and a desire for truth, not just glorification. Bagramyan's post-war activities strengthened his reputation not only as a frontline commander, but also as a major military theorist, educator, and statesman. He left a significant mark on the development of Soviet military science and the training of new generations of armed forces. Could there be a more worthy conclusion to a military career? In summary, it can be said that the legacy of Ivan Khristoforovich Bagramyan is a huge part of the military history of the 20th century. His path is a story of service, courage, and honesty. The story of an Armenian boy from a remote village who managed to rise to the rank of Marshal and join the ranks of outstanding commanders of the Great Patriotic War. His name has become a symbol of loyalty and an example for many generations of military personnel. Bagramyan was not a figure surrounded by high-profile political scandals. His star shone thanks to real work and real victories. His legacy was that he managed to put theory into practice, turning staff artistry into a real weapon that helped defeat Nazi Germany. It is especially important that Bagramyan was not associated with unnecessary sacrifices. On the contrary, his name is associated with careful planning and concern for people. In the conditions of war, where human life was often devalued, this approach made him a special figure. Soldiers respected him for not sending people into pointless attacks, but instead looking for solutions that would conserve strength. His Armenian heritage was particularly significant for thousands of members of national minorities in the USSR. It showed that the Red Army was truly a multinational force, where loyalty to the cause was more important than nationality. For Armenians, he became a symbol that a people who had endured tragedy could be proud of their representative at the highest level. In the post-war period, the memory of him lived on. His works on military history became an important contribution to science. Streets, schools, and military academies bear his name. In Armenia, Russia, and other countries of the former Soviet Union, he is considered a model of military professionalism. Is there a more vivid expression of national unity than the example of the Armenian Marshal, who became a hero of the victory of the entire Soviet people? Today, Bagramyan's legacy is not only military victories, but also a lesson in honesty, moderation, and competence. In the 21st century, his figure remains relevant because he reminds us that true strength lies not only in weapons, but also in the ability to lead people and preserve humanity, even in the most difficult trials. Ivan Khristoforovich Bagramyan went down in history as a symbol of wisdom and military valor. His life was a journey from the small village of Chardakhly to the heights of the Marshal's rank and immortal memory in history.